been world-beating Ian Watson from BBC. Ian, I think you need to unmute. Can we get Ian's audio?
Maybe humanity was the real virus all along.
We always knew today was going to be a big one for the Labour Party. This morning, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission published their long-awaited report into Labour and anti-Semitism. This morning, I was going to go through the report with a fine tooth comb, planning to absorb all the details so I could explain them to you this evening. Then Starmer made the most anti-democratic move I've witnessed in my lifetime in British politics. He suspended a former leader of the Labour Party for telling the truth. Tonight we discuss a monumental, outrageous day in British politics. We're a little stunned. We expect a lot of you are fuming or distraught. I don't know how you're reacting to this emotionally, but we'll try and stay as level-headed as possible to make sense of what has just happened. To discuss today's events, I'm joined in the studio by Rivkah Brown, editor of Vashti, and now a Novara reporter. How are you doing?
It's not been my best day, Michael, I'll be honest.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't think it has been the best day for many of us. You might have, and we did have 3,000 people waiting, in fact. You might have been waiting on our previous stream, and we've had very bad luck today, because that was probably as many people as we've ever had waiting for a show, probably other than the general election. And then our stream went down. So I do normally start the show by saying share the show link. But today it's especially important because we don't want those 3,000 people who are waiting for the show to start to go away disappointed, not knowing that there is an opportunity to watch this live episode of Tysky Sour. I'm also going to be joined down the line later in the show, as soon as possible, in fact, by Aaron Bastani. Our Fox, our technical supremo, is just sorting that one out. Let's go straight into the content of what happened today. And what I'm going to start doing is, I'm not going to go through all the detail of the EHRC report that I was planning to before this monumental fuck-up happened, but I do think it is important to go through some of the key parts because that is the context of today's events. And I do think it has been fundamentally misunderstood by most of the mainstream media. So let's go through this. So this morning at 10 a.m, the long-awaited EHRC report was released. It concluded that the party was responsible, so the Labour Party, for 3 breaches of the Equalities Act. They relate to harassment, political interference in anti-Semitism complaints, and a failure to provide adequate training to those handling them. Now, especially in terms of harassment, this has a sort of quite specific definition in the report, which might not be how people commonly understand that term. This is not to dispute that, but I'm just to say understand what the report says. Let's go through some quotes then about what their findings were. This is from the executive summary. So they write, our investigation found that the Labour Party breached the Equality Act 2010 by committing unlawful harassment through the acts of its agents in 2 of the complaints we investigated. These included using anti-Semitic tropes and suggesting that complaints of anti-Semitism were fake or smears. So those 2 counts of harassment, which they have said the Labour Party is legally responsible for, was Ken Livingstone speaking to a radio show sort of saying that most of the anti-Semitism claims was to some extent fabricated. I'm not quoting him directly, and putting the controversy down to the Israel lobby, and the other was a councillor. So these were people sort of talking about the anti-Semitism row, and the councillor also sort of brought up some Rothschilds things. But these are tweets by 2 people who were eventually suspended. It took too long for them to be suspended. That was partly to do with the prior administration. But anyway, let's go on to political interference. So on political interference, the report found, throughout the period we investigated, there was political interference in the handling of anti-Semitism complaints as part of a wider practice of Lotto involvement, so Lotto, leader of the opposition's office, in disciplinary cases that were deemed politically sensitive, as well as a distinct practice in March to April 2018 when all anti-Semitism cases were referred to Lotto. Within the sample of 70 complaint files, we found 23 instances of political interference by Lotto staff and others. These included clear examples of interference at various stages throughout the complaint handling process, including in decisions on whether to investigate and whether to suspend. Now, again, the way this is being reported in the media is, people assume if there was political interference, that was to let off anti-Semites. It turns out from the report that actually, in many cases, and I think in more cases than not, this was the leadership trying to speed up the process for kicking someone out. And, I'm going to be the first to say the Labour Party disciplinary process has been a mess for the last 5 years. And I don't think Corbyn and his team are completely, innocent of that. I don't think anyone's going to suggest that the management of the party over the last 5 years was perfect and didn't, create real hurt, especially to Jewish people in this country. I think we should all be willing to admit that and accept most of the findings of this report. But it's, as I say, it's not quite what is being suggested when you turn on the news bulletin today. And finally, so the final thing they found where the law had been broken, so these were the first two instances of the law having been broken, the Equalities Act having been contravened. Now we can go on to the one which pertains to training. So the report writes, despite the party's acknowledgement of the need for training, there was a failure to deliver adequate training to individuals responsible for handling anti-Semitism complaints. The approach to training for anti-Semitism is in stark contrast to the training provided for those handling sexual harassment complaints, for whom the Labour Party has implemented a comprehensive training scheme. This failure to provide adequate training to those handling anti-Semitism complaints contributes to a lack of trust and confidence in the complaint handling system. We find that this failure indirectly discriminated against Jewish Labour Party members. So here again, and it has to be said, most of the conclusions in this EHRC report are completely reasonable. The complaints process was a mess, and that did disproportionately affect Jewish people. The training for staff was a mess. That's partly because of political disputes about what constitutes anti-Semitism, but it happened, and it had effects which were damaging. But this is not going to be what we are predominantly discussing today, and that's because Keir Starmer made the wild decision to suspend the leader of the Labour Party. Anyway, we're going to go through 4 or 5, in fact, clips of Keir Starmer and Corbyn responding to this report and then responding to the day's event. So let's start with Keir Starmer at his press conference addressing the findings of the EHRC report.
The Labour Party I lead accepts this report in full and without qualification. We will implement all the recommendations and we will implement them in full. That process starts today. I've already instructed my staff to start work with the Commission to implement the recommendations at the earliest possible opportunity. We will provide the Commission with our action plan to achieve all of this within 6 weeks. We will establish an independent complaints process, and it will be in place as soon as possible in the new year. We will ensure that neither the leader, the deputy leader, or our offices will have any involvement in the outcome of complaints initiated under the Labour Party processes. And we are already addressing the backlog of anti-Semitism cases. In fact, there have been more cases completed in the last 6 months than in the whole of 2019. But we will go much further, and we must go further, because, as the report makes clear, this cannot be solved just by changing the party's processes and structures. We also need a culture change in the Labour Party. It must become, once again, an open and welcoming place for people from all backgrounds and all communities.
And later in the speech, in the questions and answers session, he said this.
Under my leadership, zero tolerance of anti-Semitism will mean precisely that. If you're anti-Semitic, you should be nowhere near this party, and we'll make sure you're not. And if, after all the pain, all the grief, and all the evidence in this report, there are still those who think there's no problem with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, that it's all exaggerated or a factional attack, then frankly, you are part of the problem too. And you should be nowhere near the Labour Party either.
So that was Keir Starmer's response. That's the official Labour Party response at their press conference, responding to the findings of the report. Jeremy Corbyn also gave an interview this morning where he gave his thoughts on what the report came up with. As you'll all know by now, he struck quite a different tone.
The report's findings. Which findings do you disagree with?
I think they don't acknowledge the work that I did to ensure there were proper processes brought into place. But let's be clear. Start off. One anti-Semite in the party is one anti-Semite too many. And when I became leader of the party, some complaints were received. I asked Shami Chakrabarti to undertake a review of all this, which she did. She made a number of recommendations on processes which were not implemented quickly enough. Under Jenny Formby's period as General Secretary in 2018, much more progress was made very quickly. But the numbers have been exaggerated, in my view. The public perception in an opinion poll last year was that 1/3 of all Labour Party members were somehow or other under suspicion of anti-Semitism. The reality is it was 0.3% of party members had a case against them which had to be put through the process. And so I think it's clear that we do not accept, I do not accept, Keir Starmer does not accept, none of us accept anti-Semitism in any form whatsoever.
So it was that response, that interview he gave there. You might say that wasn't the most sensitive thing to say in that, but I don't really care. What happened was he got suspended for saying something which to me seems completely reasonable. Anyway, let's get the response from the Labour Party. So he got suspended. The party were fairly tight-lipped about the particular reasons. So we'll get the comment from the Labour Party spokesperson, who says, in light of his comments made today and his failure to retract them subsequently, the Labour Party has suspended Jeremy Corbyn pending investigation. He has also had the whip removed from the Parliamentary Labour Party. There's some sort of news from the NEC about people struggling to find out what particular rule he was supposed to have broken. As far as I understand, that still hasn't been made clear. What sentence he said that was so concerning to the people in the, well, we're told it's people who are in the Labour Party disciplinary office, not Keir Starmer's office, but we'll see. Let's look at reactions to that, though. So Starmer gave an interview in response to Corbyn's suspension. Here it is.
I made it clear that we won't tolerate anti-Semitism or the denial of anti-Semitism through the suggestion that it's exaggerated or factional. And that's why I was disappointed with Jeremy Corbyn's response, and that is why appropriate action has been taken, which I fully support. Well, this is an investigation that started today. It's very important for me not to interfere with it. It has to be done properly in accordance with the rules, but it will look into the statement that was made.
And in response to that, or actually it might have been at a similar time, we've got Corbyn's response to his suspension.
Shocked and very disappointed. I've been in the Labour Party all my life. And I want to make it absolutely clear. Anti-Semitism has no place whatsoever in our party or our movement. I've opposed it and racism in all its forms all my life. And that is what I've made clear during my leadership of the party, and I'll make clear today as a Member of Parliament and proud to be one.
You said you will strongly contest your suspension. Will you be taking legal action?
What I'll be doing is appealing to the party and those that have made this decision to kindly think again. All I've done is pointed out that this terrible issue of anti-Semitism does exist, and anyone that has anti-Semitic views has no place in the Labour movement or the Labour Party, and we have to deal with it. That is why I set up a process to deal with it. All I pointed out was there was a public perception of 1/3 of Labour Party members under suspicion of anti-Semitism. The reality is very different. It was 0.03%. But that is 0.3% too many. And I think we have to chase it out as we are trying to do. That is important because I want to make clear to all communities, the Jewish community in particular, you are very welcome in the Labour Party. It is your party. It is the party that has always fought against racism, and it is unacceptable that you should be treated in any bad way whatsoever.
So he was referring there to a Survation poll which was done in 2019, which found that the average number that people sort of fell upon in the public as to what proportion of people in the Labour Party had complaints about anti-Semitism lodged against them. The average was 34%. In fact, it's 0.3%. That's why Jeremy Corbyn is saying it was exaggerated. I'm going to go to Rivkah and Aaron for their thoughts on these events in one moment. First of all, we've got 5,300 of you watching. Any of you that are new to this show, to this channel, do hit subscribe. And we go live 3 times a week. And I think it's probably pretty important for independent left-wing institutions to be growing at this point in time, because the people at the Labour Party are really fucking up. Right, Rivkah, I want to go to you. What do you make of Corbyn's comments and his suspension?
Sure. I mean, I wasn't entirely surprised by Corbyn's statement. It takes the same sort of approach that he's kind of taken throughout this whole process, which is a principled one, but often quite an unstrategic one. And I think he knew that the statement he made today would get him in trouble, and it has. I'm appalled that it has, but we've been headed this way for a long time. And now that Corbyn isn't leader of the Labour Party, he is much more vulnerable to this kind of thing and to disciplinary action for making these kinds of staunch remarks than he was previously. I think he's completely right, though. This is a view that many people, including many Jewish people within kind of the centre left, agree with, which is that anti-Semitism is a real problem in the Labour Party, but that it has been inflamed by people with an interest in the left's demise in the Labour Party and more generally. And, the idea that Jeremy Corbyn was an existential threat, the appearance of James Cleverly on the front page of The Telegraph the week before the election saying that Jews will leave this country, of course, that was all cynical, bad faith nonsense. And I'm afraid, he is right to point that out. Was it smart to point that out at this point? Definitely not. And I think that, like other members of the Labour backbench, like Nadia Whittome, for example, he should have just kept his eyes on the report and not kind of broadened this out into a kind of ideological battle between the left and the right. He should have just said, look, the report, which was relatively soft, quite straightforward, reasonably fair, was largely right. We had a bad complaints process. There are many reasons for that, some of which you can find in the report that was leaked earlier this year, as you've mentioned. But instead, he took it as a personal attack, which it was actually quite careful not to be, and in so doing, he kind of offered himself up as a bit of a sacrificial lamb, and I'm very, very sad that Keir Starmer sort of took the bait, but yeah.
And I suppose it's, Corbyn wasn't putting the bait down to be suspended, but I do see what you mean in terms of what was quite frustrating about today is one that people said, by saying this, Corbyn is denying what was in the report, because he's not. I read the report and nowhere did I think, this makes it seem that it was reasonable to say Corbyn is an existential threat to Jewish life in Britain. The things that were said about the party under Jeremy Corbyn, there was a problem, but the way it was reported was exaggerated. That doesn't mean that when anyone talks about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, they're exaggerating. No, but it clearly was, in many cases, exaggerated. Yeah. Now, there is a separate issue of whether Corbyn should have brought this up today, because, as we say, the report wasn't actually about whether or not Labour was full of anti-Semites. The report was about whether the complaints process worked well, whether two people said something on Twitter, and whether the training was good, right? And I think, taken on those terms, it didn't need to be this damaging. But I think the suspension of him is obviously appalling. If he was on the shadow cabinet, you can say that wasn't the kind of speech I wanted my people to be saying. So I'm going to, which is in my power, I'm going to say you're not going to be in my shadow cabinet. But you can't suspend someone from a political party in a two-party system for telling the truth. I
mean, arguably, Corbyn would have been suspended either way, right? He could have said, I accept everything in this report, I accept responsibility. And there would have been the same people baying for his blood. And he, in the way that we saw with Rebecca Long-Bailey, which was a kind of non-event until, for example, the Board of Deputies released a statement saying, we think Keir Starmer should seriously consider Rebecca Long-Bailey's, suitability for the shadow cabinet. It would have been something similar, and then it would have been the same story. So I don't know whether there was really an out for him, because I think the same people would have made the same kind of calls for his head.
Aaron, I want to bring you in. Can we get an Aaron Bastani? You're on mute for some reason.
Oh,
you're
well, that's not my.
You're on
me.
mute. Tell us your thoughts about the day's events.
Well, I'm just really glad, first and foremost, we've got more than 6,000 people watching tonight, because I'm sure, I know how I feel, and I'm sure many of our viewers feel utterly powerless in the face of not just an injustice, because Jeremy Corbyn, at the end of the day, is just one person. It's an appalling story, and what is happening to him, I think, is disgrace. It's disgusting. It reveals that Keir Starmer doesn't really have much respect, I think, for due process and the rule of law. Quite worrying if he wants to be the Prime Minister. But also, this was such an immense opportunity for us all to move forward and learn. right? I didn't look at the HRC report and think, let's get it behind us. And by the way, that's how most people at the top of the Labour Party look at these things. It's a PR problem. Not all of them, but many of them will look at it like that. And I thought this could be a huge learning opportunity for so many of us. And I read the report and I thought, this is a brilliant document. It's very sober. Like you say, Michael, it had a very limited, ultimately, sort of ambit. It wasn't there to discuss is Labour institution anti-Semitic. Like I said, it was a very legally confined document. And I read it and I thought, this is really good. I'm really grateful and happy to live in a country where there are official organisations which look into allegations of racism or anti-Semitism or sexism or homophobia in public bodies and can write a report which is this productive. I was really happy about that. But then that was completely and utterly torn to shreds by the idiocy of Keir Starmer, who now is such a weak individual, he's not willing to defend his own decision. And so this has been outsourced to David Evans, the General Secretary, who, when asked what charges against Jeremy Corbyn are sufficient for him to have lost the whip, he can't say. Again, do you want somebody like that in charge of the British apparatus, in charge of education, criminal justice, the healthcare system? I don't. Just on a very basic level, these people don't seem to care very much about due process. So, like I say, I'll go back to my original point. I'm very happy we've got so many viewers tonight because left institutions, critical institutions, independent institutions have never been more important.
So, I mean, I just think Aaron's kind of attitude is a good case study for why the report and Starmer's response to it and the suspension of Corbyn is so ineffective, because so many of the people that may have been really good recipients for the kind of report's recommendations and the kind of people that the report needed to speak to and needed to understand how the Labour Party needs to change, its culture change, as Starmer put it, have been turned off by this decision to suspend the former leader of the Labour Party. So many people now who might have kind of been brought round to the idea that actually, yeah, we do need a culture change and maybe we should just face forward and accept that there is a problem, are now just going to lapse back into resentment and disengagement and possibly denial. And that's like a very dangerous phenomenon for the Labour Party and for Jews.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so right. This could have been an opportunity to sort of start speaking sensibly about anti-Semitism and to remove this debate from the factionalism, which has massively confused it. I mean, one problem with the EHRC report is that it doesn't, well, in a way, it didn't set itself out to answer the question of who in the party is responsible for this. It looked at this organisation, which itself is a completely factionally riven organisation, which was subject to a civil war at the time, and they're sort of judging it as if it was a conscious agent, instead of like this field of chaos, which for so many of the last 5 years it was. So you can critique the report for that, but in terms of the conclusions, I think it was something that we could have discussed and we could have moved forward non-factionally. I think probably Keir Starmer could have created a consensus around accepting the vast majority of the proposals in that particular report. But I think what he has done by suspending someone for saying that, and he didn't say, this is also how some of the media are reporting this. They're saying that Jeremy Corbyn said the EHRC was exaggerated. He hasn't said that. What he has said, and as we've said, maybe that was a bit of a side note, because he wasn't actually, he maybe should have said that a different day. But the fact that anti-Semitism existed in the Labour Party, was massively exaggerated in the media, if you're telling people, if you say that, you get expelled, suspended from one of the two major parties in a two-party system. That is a severe threat to democracy. This idea that you can't say what everyone knows to be true. Any time I hear someone who says, it hasn't been exaggerated, if I hear someone who says, there's anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, it's really upset me, it's made me feel unsafe, it's hurt my community, I believe you. If you say no one's ever exaggerated anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, I mean, that's that's incredulous. Sorry.
I mean, yeah, it's important to distinguish between people, because there was a kind of linguistic slip that Starmer used in his speech. He said, people who deny racism in the Labour Party, anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, who say that it was exaggerated or used for factional reasons. Those are two different things. There are people who deny it. There are people who say that it's all a smear, that it's a witch hunt, and we know who those people are. And then there are people who say, no, it's a real problem, but it was exaggerated. And those are very, very different viewpoints. And as I was saying, I can only think of a very few number of people that wouldn't say that, certain media outlets have have exaggerated and played on Jewish fear. And I think actually that's quite a commonplace, if not like almost universal view. I cannot think of many people who would say that media played on Jewish fear to claim, for example, an existential threat was awaiting British Jews on the other side of the election. Like, that's an absurd claim to have made, and a dangerous one. And so I think, it's important we distinguish between people who are denialists and people who are just rationalists.
Yeah, I mean, there's this argument that Keir Starmer seems to be making, which is to move factionalism from the debate about anti-Semitism, you have to deny it ever involved factionalism. Lisa Nandy was on Radio 4 today saying this. She was asked by Evan Davies, actually, who was given a very softball interview, as in, everyone I've heard who's been interviewed about this today from the Labour Party, it's all focused on, well, should he have been suspended even quicker than he was? They're sort of like, Keir Starmer didn't immediately say in the press, which is why you have to call out the press for who they are. Say, no, actually, we're going to be reasonable, we're going to use due process. They've undermined that possibility because they haven't. But he was saying to Lisa Nandy, surely you think that some complaints were sort of used by factional opponents of Jeremy Corbyn or by the other party. I mean, surely you do. And she was like, no, I think that's exactly the wrong way to think. It's like, well, then you're lying. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. It's also like really damaging for Jewish people, particularly Jewish people on the left, who were also, that's my lived experience, for crying out loud. Like, to see people, like Ian Austin, like many others, abuse Jewish trauma in order to win factional points. That was also part of the Labour anti-Semitism crisis. Why are we not talking about that?
I'm going to read some super chats, and I'm going to go through some responses from within the Labour Party, so from MPs, trade unions, the Socialist Campaign Group. Before that, we've got some super chats. They are flying in today. Very good to see. We really appreciate that. We can't read them all, so lots of them will flash up. But we'll read some of them now. The Black Angel with 50 quid, very kind, thank you very much. The only reason I would have ever voted for Labour again is because Jeremy Corbyn is my MP. I would love Jeremy Corbyn to start a democratic socialist party. Also, solidarity with Nigeria. Solidarity with Nigeria. I presume you're talking about the End SARS protest. We covered that on our show last week, in fact. This issue of starting a new party will come to later in the show. I'm going to park that one just for now, so we can come back to it properly later. Yeti Face 14 with €35. Thank you very much. €35.74. Nice specific number for you, Michael. Keir's talk of culture change, making Labour now more welcome, etc., is horse manure. Haven't felt less welcome by the party, even when Blair was warmongering in Iraq. Sad times, comrades. I was probably too young to be in it. No, I could. Maybe I could. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to say, we don't even need to compare those two things. I'm not going to read them all. Lots of them will sort of pop up as we go, but we appreciate them. They make this show possible. I'm also going to ask you to go to our website, novaramedia.com/support, and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. It is so important for us right now to be building independent left-wing institutions, because this is not a time for people to feel despair. This is not a time for people to say, let's clock out of politics, because there is a conscious effort, and there is a conscious effort to make sure that left-wing ideas, progressive ideas, people who just want to have a more equal society are shamed out of the public sphere and have no organisation in which to organise. So to help independent organisations grow, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. Let's go to some political responses. We're going to start with Harriet Harman. So she was one of the many MPs sort of tweeting her celebration, in fact, at Jeremy Corbyn being suspended. So she is quote tweeting a tweet by Sienna Rogers of Labour List, who's sort of announcing, well, she's not, she's reporting on the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn. And she says, this is the right thing to do. If you say that anti-Semitism exaggerated for factional reasons, you minimise it and are, as Keir Starmer says, part of the problem. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. If you say that anti-Semitism was always nothing but a factional smear, yes, you are, denying lots of people's lived experience, and you're also denying things that, you're not telling the truth. If you say there was some circumstances where anti-Semitism was exaggerated for factional reasons, you're just telling the truth, right? You're not being a denialist. Right, let's go to John McDonnell. So John McDonnell's response was, on the day we should all be moving forward and taking all steps to fight anti-Semitism, the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn is profoundly wrong. In interest of party unity, let's find a way of undoing and resolving this. He continues, I urge all party members to stay calm, as that is the best way to support Jeremy and each other. Let's all call upon the leadership to lift this suspension. And finally, this is a significant response from the Socialist Campaign Group. Well, it's actually not a particularly significant response, but it's significant what their response is, because this is the block of Corbynite MPs who sit in Parliament, 30-odd MPs. They tweeted from their account, "We firmly oppose the decision to suspend Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party. We will work tirelessly for his reinstatement. The fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of racism is central to the struggle for a society based on justice and equality." Corbyn, for his part, has also called for his supporters not to leave the Labour Party. Aaron, I want to get your response on sort of the political response, both from Jeremy Corbyn's allies and his factional enemies, I suppose, and then also this huge debate which is going on right now about whether or not people should stay in the party or cancel their direct debits.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
The first point I would want to respond to is the leaving the party. Firstly and foremost, if you can't stand to be in the Labour Party, I would insist that you either stay in or join a trade union. And I think there's absolutely no excuse to not do that. And if you're an affiliated trade union to the Labour Party, you will still be able to get a vote in its leadership elections. That would be the first point. If you just stick to the back teeth, if you think I can't be a member of this organisation, that's your personal choice. That's what I would say. Please consider either joining or remaining in a trade union. Secondly, I don't think it's wise for people to leave the Labour Party en masse. This is precisely what the Labour right want. I believe, it's my opinion, this is precisely what Keir Starmer wants. I believe it's precisely what David Evans wants. And the mission here is not to beat the Tories. To do all of this, to respond in this way, in the present context, which is, this week, tens, hundreds of thousands of children are going hungry. I know people setting up ad hoc WhatsApp groups and delivering food to people they've never met to make sure that children get lunch, get dinner, get breakfast. Now, in that context, it does seem like the Labour right's priority is smashing the left. And there has to be a big question asked. Is Keir Starmer a Tyrannosaurus Rex when it comes to Jeremy Corbyn, when it comes to the left of his party? But when it comes to the Tories, he's like little Bo Peep. And that's really concerning. And I think it speaks to the fact, as I've said, they aren't interested in winning the next general election. By the way, I don't think they will, because divided parties, whether it's left, right, centre, don't win general elections. And then what I'd add to that is that in terms of the people going for, going against, there's meant to be a due process here. There's meant to be a protocol by which his case is investigated. Richard Leonard, I think, was quite good. Richard Leonard was asked the question. He said, look, there's an internal disciplinary action going on. I don't want to comment on it. Very professional. I've always said that's what people should do. And I think, again, I talked about this. Would you want somebody like David Evans and Keir Starmer in charge of the British state when it could potentially compromise your civil liberties? Somebody like Harriet Harman. Does she believe in due process? Does she believe in, equality under the law? Does she believe the right to effectively the principle of a fair trial? I don't think she does. I don't think many of these people do. And I think that goes back a very long way. And I think it explains fundamentally a deeply authoritarian streak within the Labour Party over the last 30 years. And it's born of fundamentally an aversion to ideology, not really a belief in anything, but the pursuit of power for its own sake. And I think that partly explains also why they hate the left so much, is that actually these people believe in something, whether or not you agree with it or not. And the people coming out in defence of Jeremy Corbyn, I'll finish on this point, I don't think I don't think they're actually defending him in a meaningful way. So what are the implications? What will you do if Jeremy Corbyn's expelled? What are the consequences going to be? Where's the leverage? How are you going to influence the outcome? I saw John McDonnell tweet about this, and it's still a sort of very gently, they should reconsider. But that precise mentality, and by the way, I think it's very commendable. I think it's a good way to live your life normally. But it's that precise mentality which has led the Labour left, the Socialist Campaign Group, to precisely this point. Now, I'm not suggesting they will leave the Labour Party, and I don't think they should throw their toys away. But there needs to be here an effective display of solidarity on a very basic level, and it should go beyond the Socialist Campaign Group. Any MP that doesn't speak out about this in a way that says, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn is being given, he's not being furnished with natural principles of justice, I wouldn't trust them to be running the country. It's as simple as that. I'm never going to vote Tory, so you can know for sure I don't trust them either. But I'm not going to give my consent to people who don't believe in equality under the law and basic principles of justice. I'm not going to do that. We went down that path. It led with nominally social democratic politicians favouring arbitrary, extraordinary rendition, effectively kidnapping. It led to an invasion of Iraq. It led to incredibly racist policies. And I'll finish with this. People saying this is the darkest day in Labour's history. How dare you? How dare you? It's been made darker by the fact that Keir Starmer destroyed a huge opportunity. I really mean this. Hundreds of thousands of people could have learned a great deal about this. And I feel one of the upshots of the last few years, actually, many people have learned a great deal about quotidian, everyday forms of anti-Semitism. I think there was that opportunity there. And even until today, it could have been taken, and it hasn't been taken. But furthermore, how dare you say that when there was the Iraq War? There are children being born today in Fallujah with deformities, with arms and legs missing, because of the use of certain weapons against them by coalition forces. How dare you say that was more acceptable, and that's fine compared to this? Again, it just shows a complete detachment from the lived reality of most people out there. It shows they don't really care about dealing with issues of anti-racism across the country more generally, not just within the Labour Party, although, of course, it's a microcosm. And I honestly don't think you could find a more venal, unprincipled, often immoral set of people than you find in much of the parliamentary Labour Party.
I mean, I think that point about perspective is so important. The idea that you can say this is the darkest day in Labour Party history when we literally invaded a country without provocation, and as you say, there are still children being born deformed. Millions, almost 1 million people died. It depends, varying on the estimation you're looking at. But that was, when you look at what the harassment was found in this, and I'm not trying to diminish. I'm saying I think we should have spent today reading the report sensitively and working out how can we respond so that the Labour Party is a welcoming place for all. But to suggest that Ken Livingstone and a councillor who I haven't heard of sending some tweets which lent into tropes is worse than invading a country in the Middle East and destabilising a whole region and leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths is... I mean, there's something going on there, isn't there? I mean, there's many ways you can describe that. Aaron, I did just want to come back just actually for a little bit of clarification, because you've said there you don't think people should leave the party. You've also said you feel like McDonnell's response, and I know you have a lot of respect for John McDonnell, but you think his response is overly conciliatory. What's your Goldilocks spot for not leaving the Labour Party, but also not being as conciliatory as John McDonnell is sounding there? What do you want to see MPs, for example, do?
Well, I don't know about MPs. I mean, I think the general disposition should be this is unacceptable. It flies in the principles of fairness and justice. That's the basic thing. If you don't believe in fairness and justice, I don't want you in charge of anything. I don't want you to be in charge of a bunch of school children. I don't want you to be a traffic warden. I don't want you to be, the milk monitor, let alone an MP, let alone the Prime Minister. That's the first thing. And I'm kind of shocked that MPs aren't just basically going on a quite elementary level going, this isn't right. Forget about we need a solution that looks out for everybody. Is this right or wrong? Is this a fair representation? The Guardian story about Jeremy Corbyn was crazy. It was crazy. It was like reading and I expect more from the Guardian. I do expect more from the Guardian. It was like reading a press release from a faction. That's what it was, right? And I expect, of course, the Guardian slant on something, our slant on something. That's how the media works, and people can make their own decision. You want as many of those as possible have an informed decision. But the Guardian just kind of shocked me. And so I think in that broader context of people utterly misrepresenting somebody, i.e. Jeremy Corbyn, you have to say, first of all, this isn't fair, this isn't just, and say, look, ultimately, 10 million people voted for this guy, voted for our party last year. How many of them do you think find this acceptable? Seriously. I mean, I would argue a majority don't find this acceptable. The fact we've got 7,000 people watching this right now, I think clearly it's a major topic for people. And it goes really to the core of what kind of party does Labour want to be. I think Keir Starmer's quite obvious about this. He wants it to be a party for millionaires, billionaires, donors, landlords, and people that just, care about sound bites and looking slick on a TV. This is a guy who says he's going to deliver a Green New Deal, but drives around in a 4x4. So, it looks to me like we're dealing with people who aren't remotely serious about addressing the major problems of our time, which include all forms of racism and bigotry. And I think that should be called out as such. I don't think that's a particularly radical position to take. And I say this as somebody who says the EHRC report was a fantastic, diligent piece of work. I commend everybody involved. I think it was phenomenal. I think that, right? And I'm still saying, wow, what a venal, unscrupulous, self-serving bunch of people. I don't want them representing me, and I certainly don't want them running the country.
And we're going to talk about sort of the media response and the representation of today's events, the very lazy representations or disingenuous, however you want to frame them, in a moment. First of all, I want to bring up a few more sort of responses from inside the party and then some details of what the party leadership have been doing today. So in terms of responses, I've shown you some MPs. We've also got the trade unions. So Len McCluskey, General Secretary of Unite. A grave act of injustice has been done. If it's not reversed, it will create chaos with the party and in doing so compromise Labour's chances of a general election victory. A split party will be doomed to defeat. He also calls on Starmer to implement the EHRC report in full and for members not to leave. And Dave Ward says the EHRC is a serious and detailed document. He's of the CWU, the Posties Union, and everyone in the party should read and understand it. Keir Starmer's political decision to suspend Jeremy Corbyn, a lifelong anti-racist campaigner, flies in the face of the report. It's fundamentally wrong and needs to change. This is what I want you to bring up in terms of what the party have been doing today. So this was sent to me by someone who received this email, and it is from, I don't know who Tom is, but it's from someone in the Labour Party who's sent this out to all staff members. Morning. Today will be a difficult day. Can we get this up yet? Today will be a difficult day for the Labour Party, including on social media. If you see any members who you believe may have broken the party's rules with what they've posted on social media, whether that be on anti-Semitism, the independence of the EHRC, or reducing the EHRC's report to smears, staff can submit evidence here, and then there's a Google Doc link which I've covered up. This includes any branch or CLP account posting those things. This is a short-term, rapid way to submit a complaint during what could be a high-pressure moment. You can still report a complaint through the normal channels if you have a response. I also have an open communications channel with the social media networks if we need to escalate anything quickly, so please let me know if I can help. I want to go to you for your thoughts on that, particularly internal memo.
It goes completely against what the EHRC is saying, which is that there needs to be a transparent, standard complaints process. He's saying, why don't submit your complaints here in the special channel, or you can use the normal channels. Okay, so what's the complaints process? And, this just goes hand in hand exactly with, Keir Starmer or Keir Starmer's alleged suspension of Jeremy Corbyn in a completely kind of extrajudicial sort of way. Yeah, it's just bizarre, really, and so profoundly hypocritical. I mean, it's just shocking. I mean, like, I was speaking to someone earlier today who was telling me that CLPs haven't been allowed to even discuss the EHRC report, nor the Panorama documentary, nor the IHRA, and this is shocking as a Jewish Labour member. You have to be able to discuss these issues, of course. People should be held accountable for what they say in those discussions, but quashing them and suppressing them and creating this kind of false consensus is only going to fester people's opinions further. And I really don't see the point in it. I think it's so important that we have it out and discuss the finer points of things, because actually so much of this anti-Semitism crisis can and does fall apart through close inspection. And that's something that so many Jewish leftists have known for so long, that there is a kernel, an important kernel of truth and of pain and of abuse and hurt that that cannot be erased and shouldn't be, but that around that has kind of built this massive and damaging narrative that has become this immovable object in our kind of discourse, and that is so dangerous because it's false, basically. And what I was saying, I was speaking to a sort of right-wing journalist the other day, and something he said to me which really kind of chilled me was, I just think the argument's been won. And he's right. The argument has been won that Labour is institutionally anti-Semitic, which is why, the EHRC report, which was far from accusing Labour Party of being far from accusing the Labour Party of being institutionally anti-Semitic, was kind of ridden roughshod over by people who already had made their minds up and already knew what they wanted, which was Jeremy Corbyn to be suspended. And so I'm really scared that history will kind of remember Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite who ruled over an institutionally anti-Semitic party, and that any attempt to correct that narrative or to, in a way that might actually help us heal the factions within the Labour Party and, as Aaron said, win an election in, a few years' time, is completely shot to shit. Like, not going to happen.
As I said, I mean, we're gonna go into detail in terms of the media representation of this. But first of all, I think, we have to bring this up at this point, looking at that leaked email from the Labour Party. How many centrists, in fact, have said one of the problems with the left is they're so censorious, they think everyone is either agrees with them or is evil. Which is a misrepresentation anyway. But here what you've got people saying you have to agree 100% with our analysis of what happened over the last 4 years, which happens to have serious holes in it, which are obvious for all to see. But you have to accept them 100%, or you are a racist and you're excluded from this party. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what they're saying. And that is not just, because I know I think it's an awful shame if, Jeremy Corbyn goes down in history as an anti-Semite. I don't think he's an anti-Semite. I do think there were problems of leadership when it came to this issue in the party. That was something that was also found in the report, which I think consensus could have been built upon. But even besides sort of the issue of how this particular issue is remembered in the Labour Party, I think the fact that you can tell people that you cannot have a conversation about something is dangerous. I think there is going to be some serious resentment building up. And there's so many people in the Labour Party who are just terrified now. They're just sort of like, I have all these thoughts, which I kind of know are true. And I'm not saying that the thoughts that I'm saying I know are true, and not that this has all been a witch hunt and that everything was completely made up, but that there was factional involvement, and these were exaggerated by some newspapers and weaponized by some people. Yeah. If you admit what was obviously true publicly, you're at risk of being kicked out of a party which you have spent 5, 10, 20 years devoting a large part of your life to, and just so happens to be one of the only two parties in this country who can ever get into power. So the idea, this is so chilling to make people, what it's essentially doing is terrifying people out of the democratic political process. There's no other way of putting it.
But I mean, the point, I think, is that Jeremy Corbyn didn't need to go there today. And that, like I was saying, Nadia's statement just did not go there. Her statement didn't even mention Jeremy's suspension. She just was saw the trash fire and just steered well clear of it. And I think that's what he should have done, because actually the report itself didn't damn him, could have actually been a bit of a coup for him if he'd have just treated it in the right way. But instead, he decided to treat it as and anticipate the bad faith attacks, which were inevitable, and focus on those. And actually, this could have been a bit of a strategic dodge for him, and it was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the response was particularly smart or particularly relevant, actually. I think the issue with Corbyn's response today, and the idea that you should suspend him for it is McCarthyite and bizarre. But if you say that wasn't, as you say, I mean, I'm just going to repeat what you're saying. The report wasn't about was the representation of the Labour Party fair or not. That it didn't make a judgment on that. So Corbyn didn't really need to bring that up. I think he probably could have, like Aaron's just said, sort of say, I kind of agree with everything that was in this. We did have some problems sort of organising our disciplinary process. I've always been incredibly open about that. Yeah. And those 2 tweets you found, which you have said are abusive, I agreed, and that's why they got suspended. And we apologise for any hurt caused. Let's move on. Instead of sort of, reopening that particular wound. But again, that does not mean that we should not hold firm to say people telling the truth, even if you find it politically inconvenient on that particular day, or even if you find it a little bit insensitive on that particular day, is not a reason to expel someone from one of the 2 major political parties in a 2-party system.
I think also Aaron kind of in his response earlier was sort of modelling what I think should be the response of Labour Party members and supporters to Corbyn's suspension, which is not to relitigate the anti-Semitism crisis, although that is sort of tempting, and I've been drawn into that myself today, even on this show. But I very much think that our response should be, this is not due process, and this is a contravention of the principles that Starmer has committed to, even today, as a result of the EHRC. No lotto interference in disciplinary cases, transparent process, and as Aaron was saying, more broadly, a demonstration of the commitment to the rule of law and fair trial. So I think we should focus on that rather than saying he's not an anti-Semite, because I think, let's not make it about that. Let's hold them to account for their kind of principles that they themselves have committed to. I think it's just an easier and less painful route.
I forgot to put it in, actually, the script. But there was an incredible tweet, which Aaron shared with me today, which is not a tweet, sorry, it's a screenshot of Tom Watson telling The Independent, Corbyn should personally expel every anti-Semite in the party. You know, one of the key findings of the EHRC report is that there was political interference. And they don't really distinguish particularly between whether it was to make a sentence harsher or...
Yeah.
I suppose it's a sentence, an outcome harsher, or a sanction harsher, sorry, or weaker. They don't make that distinction. So Tom Watson there, in telling the papers and being celebrated for it, you know, no one said when Tom Watson said Jeremy Corbyn should personally suspend all of these people. You didn't get Peston saying, well, I think that would be counter to due process and might be breaking equality law, which is essentially what the EHRC has said. Everyone's like, oh, Tom Watson, so brave, so proud. He knows all the answers. No, he was proposing the Labour Party break the law. Right, so the idea what the EHRC has found is all Corbyn's fault is nonsense, and it also shows how, as Aaron says, how unserious so many people were about this particular issue. I want to go through a few sort of representations in the media, then I'm going to go straight to you, Aaron. But first of all, let's go to a few super chats. Jacqueline Deblue with 200 quid. Thank you very much. That's very kind. Another great day with wonderful news wherever you look, with the miserable smiley face, which I assume is the tone in which you were saying that. Glad to have you through to help me try and make sense of some of it, and happy to contribute to your reporting. Thank you so much. We do massively appreciate it. TC with a fiver. If we retreat from the party, we should have a strategic reason and process for doing so. Otherwise, it is a rout. Emotional withdrawal is not a tactic. You could not have put it, I could not have put it better myself. That's exactly what I believe. When on Twitter, people are sort of saying to me, oh, by saying stay in the party, you're accepting that Starmer's maybe going to change. No, I mean, it's just, it's weighing up what's the best option. If you want to have a role in mainstream political life in this country, as I've said, it's basically a two-party system. That's why suspending someone for saying a true statement is so appalling and so outrageous, because alternatives to the Labour Party are very difficult to build. In party political terms, in terms of left-wing institutions, we absolutely should be building independent ones. But in terms of a political party to stand in elections, it's a toughie. It's a tough thing to do.
I think James Schneider put it on Tisky a while ago. In fact, quite recently, he said you should keep one foot in the party, and that's kind of how I see it. You know, not all of my political activity is ever going to be dedicated to the Labour Party, and probably not even most of it, but it's definitely important to me to have an eye on what's going on in Labour, as well as trying to build a left movement that can put pressure on the Labour Party from without, through trade unions, through tenants organising, through, movements like, Jewish movements like Na'amod or Jewish Solidarity Action. Like, these are important groups that are not party political, but that will, we hope, I guess, push the Labour Party in a certain direction.
We've got 7,000 people watching. If you are new to the show, if you are new to this channel, please do hit subscribe. We go live 3 times a week. It's great, if I say so myself. Novara Media has got full of so many talented people. Aaron, Ash, both put out big interviews with big names, great to camera videos. Do make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel. Right, let's go to see how the media have covered this. They haven't covered themselves in glory as usual. So the move by Starmer was very much egged on by the media in terms of suspending Jeremy Corbyn, and this was led as ever by The Guardian and Observer. And this is the issue on which they are worse, other than foreign policy, actually, when it comes to Latin American politics, also very bad. But let's look at how it developed. So first you get misrepresentation. So let's get up this tweet from Guardian Politics. Jeremy Corbyn rejects findings of ECHR report on... They've got it wrong anyway. Spell check, spelling problem. EHRC report on anti-Semitism in Labour. Now, if you watched the video we showed, or if you read his full statement on Facebook, that is not a good representation of what he said, right? Mm. He said, this is very important, we need to deal with this, but also I do have to defend myself, these claims were somewhat exaggerated, blah, blah, blah. He didn't say, this is bullshit, I reject this report. That's the impression you get from that. So we have misrepresentation, then we get a motivated prediction. By motivated prediction, what I mean is someone predicts something is going to happen in the knowledge that the more people who say it's going to happen, the more likely it is to happen. So this is John Craze, he's a parliamentary sketch writer for, again, The Guardian. He writes, given Starmer's statement, this is before the suspension, it's hard to see how he doesn't throw out Corbyn and others from the party. The problem with this is that in Starmer's statement, he said, if you say that all claims of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party are exaggerated, you don't have a place in the party. He didn't say if it's exaggerated. I mean, So, I mean, if he was being consistent with his speech, he wouldn't have done this. And then let's go for some outright vindictive opportunism. So this is Sonia Soda, who is a leader writer at The Observer. So she tweeted after the first two statements from Starmer and Corbyn, "How does Keir Starmer not expel Corbyn after his absolute shocker of a statement this morning?" Then Tom Hamilton, who used to work for the party, replies, "Because that would be Lotto, the leader of the opposition office, involvement in a disciplinary process which the EHRC has just said shouldn't happen in the very report he was commenting on." Then she says, "Fair point." Then an hour passes, 2 hours passes, and she's back. "Of course, Starmer had to suspend Corbyn after that outrageous statement of denial today. It was an ethical, not a political imperative, but I don't think there are any political downsides to it all either, incidentally." And then she goes on, "The only people who would defend Corbyn after that statement have no place in the Labour Party, and it's good Keir Starmer has just made that clear to the country." Aaron, I want to go to you on The Guardian and Observer's role in all of this and how they have demonstrated that today.
The two worst newspapers in the country, without any shadow of a doubt. And I say this in all seriousness, actually, regardless of what's happened today. In terms of original news gathering and reporting, The Observer is by far the worst newspaper in the country. Terrible. And The Guardian, The Guardian has a very different problem, which has excellent reporting often good features, but its political comment analysis, its political editors, its diplomatic editor Patrick Wintle, for instance, cheering on the overthrow of Morales, a very different set of problems, but again, equally egregious. At least with the Times, the Financial Times, you can read it and say, look, I don't really trust these guys, but it's often well researched. It's got a lot of money involved.
Oh, you've frozen, Aaron. I'm not sure why that has happened. We'll get you back as soon as you unfreeze. In the meantime, what I'm going to do is show you a clip of Luciana Berger speaking to LBC today.
No, I have to ask for your response to Jeremy Corbyn's claim that the scale of the problem was dramatically overstated for political reasons. And I just, for the record, Luciana, I'm more uncomfortable asking you that than anyone else I've put it to today for reasons that you've just outlined. But I must ask you.
I have no words for that response today. That response is off the back of an extensive 18-month investigation by a statutory body that, as you pointed out at the start, was created by the Labour Party when it was in government. And that independent public body has found the Labour Party today guilty of serious failings, and it lays the blame squarely at the door of the Labour Party leadership, of which Jeremy Corbyn was at the helm. And what people were looking for today was some acknowledgement of the pain and the hurt and the distress caused to so many, whether that was in the party or the wider impact on the British Jewish community in this country. And in fact, not just the British Jewish community, but other minority communities that were worried about, would it be them next? Because the experience of one minority community is not often confined to that minority community. And that response just is beyond the pale.
I assume he didn't ask what particular minority she's talking about, because most other minorities in the country are scared of the Conservative Party. But anyway, that's besides the point. I think, her talking about the pain of all of this for Jewish people, obviously completely accept that. But this idea that, again, it's sort of presenting Corbyn as having rejected what the report finds. He doesn't reject what the report finds. He makes a somewhat separate point. I mean, what did you make about that clip you just saw there?
Yeah, I mean, look, Luciana Berger's just never going to be Jeremy Corbyn's biggest fan. I don't think she would have been happy whatever he said, to be honest. But I do understand that, Corbyn's statement didn't strike an entirely conciliatory tone. But as I say, if he had done, he probably would have been even more indicted for admitting guilt. And so he mitigated his statement by saying, look, this was a problem, but also there were exaggerations, which I think, was accurate, probably wasn't strategic. He probably should have kind of rolled over. But I don't entirely share Luciana's view that it was beyond the pale. And I think that, this kind of view is definitely coloured by her kind of experiences in the party more generally, and her own personal experiences of harassment, of anti-Semitic harassment, which which I think kind of, yeah, I mean, what can I say? In the same way that the EHRC report doesn't, the EHRC report does make clear that that anti-Semitism existed within the party. It didn't, contrary to what she's saying, claim that those were the responsibility of the Labour Party leadership. It actually referred to the Labour Party generally, the Labour Party machine, of which, Ian McNicol was at the head for a long, long period. And during that time, the leaked report suggests, he and his team sat on and delayed and kind of mishandled complaints. And so actually, she's not right. It doesn't lay it at his door. But I understand why she would, because it is kind of convenient to have an individual to blame, and much harder to put your finger on a much more nebulous, a sort of issue which manifests in much more complex, subtle ways. And so I understand why she and why a lot of the people that were calling for Jeremy Corbyn's suspension wanted that, because it seems like a simple solution to a complex problem. But actually, this is why it's worth reading the EHRC report in full, because it is a complex problem and it's worth understanding.
But what never happens in those interviews is, and I didn't hear that whole interview, I heard the whole interview between Margaret Hodge and Eddie Mair today on LBC, and she was saying very similar things. And this was after he'd been suspended. And what Eddie Mair never says is, but you know what Corbyn said, right? You might find it insensitive, you might have thought it wasn't the best statement to make today, but it was true, right? It was true. Many cases have been exaggerated. That doesn't mean it's not a problem, but it was. They don't say that, because that is to break the spell. I mean, they're probably terrified of being called anti-Semitic now as well.
Yeah.
And because sort of people have put certain comments and conversations off bounds, it means that there are certain people who are professional politicians who are being put under no scrutiny whatsoever when a leader who they support has just taken completely, outrageous action, which under the tiniest amount of scrutiny would fall apart, but no one seems willing to offer that. Aaron, I want your thoughts on the media, but also what happens next. We're going to have to move to that part of the conversation. I mean, this seems to have sort of blown. There was a bit of a truce going on in the Labour Party. This has definitely blown that up. What do you see happening now?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that James O'Brien's not a journalist. James O'Brien should be, I see him as an inheritor of like Jerry Springer or Jeremy Kyle. That's basically what it is. It's shocking broadcast media, right? You're an idiot. I agree with you. This person's brilliant. This person's appalling. No nuance whatsoever. He's a shock jock, right? But because he has a relatively plummy voice, because he comes from the right place, nobody says that. And because he says certain things politically, he kind of gets away with it. But that's what he is. He's effectively, I think, a glorified Dan Wootton on talk radio, for instance. That's the genre of media. They want as many people to be watching these clips as possible. And that's a broader thing we need to think about within the media environment, which is unhealthy. Let's park it for one moment. Secondly, anybody who's accused of anything has to, and this, by the way, we haven't said this yet, I don't think. This is in the EHRC report. What Jeremy Corbyn has done in terms of what he has said is not contrary to the EHRC report, in so much as somebody has the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech. They're not diminishing something. They're not saying it doesn't exist. If they're saying, I don't agree with an exact kind of prognosis, right? This is specified very clearly within the EHRC report itself. And again, another key aspect of the rule of law is that somebody has the right to defend themselves. Right, and this today wasn't the final take. The whole point, again, this has been such a massively misunderstood process. People thought this was going to be like, Hawkeye with LBW in cricket, or VAR in football. Decision, Labour, institutionally anti-Semitic. No, this is an iterative process, and Keir Starmer said today they're going to reply to the HRC within 6 weeks. And Jeremy Corbyn, within that iterative process, is allowed, and I agree with Rivkah and yourself, Michael, I don't think it's necessarily the wisest thing to do, but he is allowed to defend himself. And what nobody mentioned at all, is that he said on his Facebook post, he said, I endorse all the recommendations. I hope they're all implemented as quickly as possible. What more do you want, right? He's denying the scale of the problem. He's absolutely not denying the scale of the problem. He hasn't denied it exists. He hasn't denied that it exists in the Labour Party. And he said that all the recommendations should be adopted as quickly as possible. So, I mean, again, that wasn't, James O'Brien didn't say that. Eddie Mair didn't say that. And so I wonder, are these people journalists? I don't think they are. I look at you, Michael, or I look at Rivkah. Rivkah did a great piece for us recently, done 2 great pieces for us of reportage, really upstanding and professional, really, really professional piece of journalism. Or Michael, the way you talked about COVID-19, I think you've been really meticulous in terms of how you analyse things. Now, clearly you have a certain bent on things. You're on the left, but I think it's good that you tell people that so they know where you're coming from. I think that's a really important point. But I honestly think you believe in an objective truth and you try and get there. And that's the job of a journalist. And I don't think that's how James O'Brien operates. I don't think it is at all. In terms of Luciana Berger, I believe, I don't know if it's still the case, but at one point there were 4 people in prison who were making either threats or they'd committed various criminal activities relating to Luciana Berger, and they were in prison. So you have to understand, this is a lady who's gone through a really tough time. All of them were from the far right. All of them were from the far right. And this is, again, something I think it's a tragedy that comes out of today. I'm not saying that there isn't racism on the left or that somebody who votes for the Labour Party can't be racist. Hell, there are many Labour MPs, for instance, who don't seem to think that racism against travellers is an issue. But what I am saying is that today, I tweeted this earlier, was the best day, probably in my lifetime, for the Tories. This was the best day ever for them. I think it sews up for them the next general election. I think it shows that Keir Starmer has the electability of Neil Kinnock and the values of Tony Blair, precisely the wrong thing to have. But I also think it really gives carte blanche to far-right racism. I really think that. Because now the Tories can go into the next general election saying, you're such a racist party, you suspended your own leader. And Keir Starmer wanted that same man to be the Prime Minister. And so I really think now it's a tragic, hugely destructive and entirely avoidable event which will undermine any anti-racist politics in this country for at least 5 years, probably longer. In terms of what next, in terms of how people respond, do you mean sort of relating to the media, Michael, or more politically?
So, I mean, will this stand on one sense? Do you think they're going to have to roll back from this? Because there's a sense in which it seems like the pushback might have been larger than people at first believed. Do you think they're actually going to expel the guy?
Well, I saw, for instance, a take from Steve Richards, who, he's not on the left by any stretch. I thought he basically said it was a very bad move by Starmer. Chris Mullins, former Labour MP, he said it was a very bad move, and I think they're right, because Keir Starmer now has to expel Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party. He has no alternative. Otherwise, he's going to look very weak, and that's toxic. That's precisely what happened to Kinnock. Kinnock tried to look strong to the country by attacking the left. He got pats on the head from the establishment for a couple of years, and then come the election, come 1987, come 1992, what happens? His party is seen as divided. He's seen as obsessed with internal matters, not talking to the country at large. I think the exact same thing is now going to happen with Keir Starmer, which leaves him with little alternative. He's going to feel immense pressure to now expel Jeremy Corbyn. The problem is, however, as we've said, and it seems pretty clear here, Jeremy Corbyn's got a very good case according to the EHRC. That might not be a lawful thing to do. And so best case scenario for Keir Starmer is he expels Jeremy Corbyn and he somehow would get away with it. And this is a toxic political issue for 2 or 3 years. I don't know what's going through his head. But at the same time, we have to remember, this is the person who thought that Owen Smith would be a great leader of the Labour Party, who talked about having a 21-inch penis. This is somebody
29.
who thought 29-inch penis. This is somebody who said that 1 minute we should remain, then respect the vote, then we should, remain, and now he's respecting the vote again. This is the guy who drives an SUV, and yet he's claiming we need to decarbonise as quickly as possible. He's not a serious political figure. And in part, that's understandable. He's only been in politics 5 years. But he's shown a shocking lack of judgment. I think I'll finish with this. It was one of the most frustrating things with the leadership campaign. And Rebecca Long-Bailey ran a poor campaign. She didn't really go in on these issues. He's an untested person. I have no idea what makes this man tick. No idea whatsoever. And if you want to be the Prime Minister, people have a right to know what you believe in, who you are, what your core is, and what your personality is. Now, I don't like Boris Johnson. I don't think he should be the Prime Minister. But my God, we all know who he is. Who is Keir Starmer? He's presented himself as this liberal human rights lawyer, and yet in a matter of months, he's taken the Labour Party on a path which is completely antithetical to human rights and social liberalism. And in this instance, the rule of law. And all for what? It's not quite clear.
I'm going to go through some super chats. Guaj with 50 quid, very kind. Thank you very much. Keep up the good work. Excellent analysis from Novara Media today. Nishat, 1976, £99.99. Thank you, very kind. And this is actually a really important comment, I think. Great show tonight. I hope JC gets to see due process, but it seems a lot of people have made up their minds already. As a member of a minority in the UK, JC made me think I was treated the same as everyone else by the Labour leadership, something I no longer feel. And I think this is something which is completely ignored by the mainstream media, the leadership of the Labour Party, basically everyone discussing this, which is by saying this is the most shameful day in Labour Party history ever. You ignore all of the people with Iraqi heritage who've had their family bombed by the Labour Party. Yeah. You ignore all of the people who were related to someone who were sort of castigated as bogus asylum seekers at the beginning of the New Labour period. The people who are in colonised country. The Labour Party backed colonialism. This idea that essentially anything that happened to brown people that the Labour Party did, well, all parties do that.
Yeah.
And then this happens. And yes, as we've said, real pain, real hurt was caused. It's really worth reading the report. And there are some things in it which do make you think like, oh, that is, especially the idea of, people going to Labour Party meetings and not feeling welcome. I do think that happened, and that is tragic. But the extent to which the other injustices that the Labour Party have historically done, which, to be honest, are much bigger, is, I think, offensive, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting, to your point about brown people, that obviously there are Jewish people who are of colour. But I would say to that this is precisely the point, that anti-racism, as Luciana Berger points out in her statement to what's his name on LBC, yes, she points out that struggles against racism are interconnected, and that's precisely what the Jewish left was arguing before this election in December. That what was happening in the Conservative Party, very obviously towards kind of brown and black people and refugees and the poor, was a struggle that was bound up with that of Jewish people, and that by sectioning off anti-Semitism as a kind of different, separate category of racism, we were impoverishing our understanding of what anti-racism and indeed kind of collective struggle and liberation means, which is the only kind of effective struggle. What Keir Starmer has done today goes no further to protecting Jewish people from, the kind of thing that has been happening in America in a much more violent and obvious way, like, the shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue or, Charlottesville protests. But, here too, we have graffiti and far-right marches and stuff. That is no less likely after today and the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, it probably emboldens people who are on the far right, because they can see that the left of the Labour Party is as weak as it has ever been. And so, I would argue that this is when we're thinking strategically about the fight against racism in this country, this is a setback, and this is probably quite a scary moment for a lot of people, Jewish and non-Jewish, people who needed a left-wing Labour kind of contingent, a left-wing Labour leadership at one time, and are now kind of just never going to see any form of government that caters to them in our foreseeable future, as Aaron says.
I'm going to go through some more super chats. We'll keep sort of responding to them as they come in. So Tommy Brady with a tenner. A couple of years ago, I was too sick to work. I started watching Novara, and now I've just started a journalism degree. Thanks for the inspiration. Tommy Brady, thank you so much for the support, and thank you for the one piece of good news we've received today. Very, very nice to have something positive to think about. T.E. Yates with 20 quid. NEC elections coming up. The Labour Party is still the best vehicle we have for positive societal and economic change, given our anachronistic first-past-the-post system. P.S. Regular viewer, first-time super chat. Keep up the good work, Novara. Thank you so much, T.E. Yates. And again, I mean, it seems like most of us in this discussion today agree with this idea that don't stay in the Labour Party because the Labour Party is inherently good. Don't stay in the Labour Party because ultimately justice will prevail. That's not necessarily going to happen. Stay in the Labour Party if you want to. I mean, if you really want to leave, fine. I'm not going to be here begging you to stay. But if you are going to stay, and I'm going to stay, and I'm not going to hold my tongue. I'm not going to say. Actually, I'm going to put this in this way, which is that I think if people were to stay in the Labour Party and by doing so, sort of said, I am going to police what I say, even if I know it's obviously true. if you're going to walk around being a member of the Labour Party, and because you are a member of the Labour Party, you're too terrified to ever say what you actually believe, or too terrified to point out when the media isn't necessarily being honest about something. Don't stay in the Labour Party if it means you have to pretend the media in this country isn't biased, which is essentially what Keir Starmer is asking you to do. But I think don't leave of your own accord. If you stay in the Labour Party and they try and kick you out because you said that maybe the media wasn't particularly objective in its covering of the anti-Semitism crisis, then maybe we can all crowdfund and go to court. Because I think what Keir Starmer wants you to do is leave. Fundamentally, that seems to be his strategy quite clearly. It's more difficult for them if they have to find concocted, trumped-up reasons to kick everyone out, because that opens them up to all sorts of vulnerabilities. So let them push you. Let them push you. Don't jump. That's my analysis of the leverage you have. A couple of more. AK De Scholar with a tenner. Hope those celebrating Corbyn's suspension will also call on Keir to penalise the staffers and MPs who engage in anti-black racism and call Keir out on dismissing concerns of BAME members and BLM demands. If you're thinking about sort of the tone of statements, Jesus Christ. Kieran Cav with a tenner. My girlfriend Molly said she wishes she could donate. £5 from me, £5 from Molly. Thank you so much. Please wish her luck running for our uni's Labour stock as a women's rep. She would do a great job. Molly, good luck. I hope you become women's rep at your university. We need some electoral wins. Lachlan McRae, great show, never needed Navarro more than now. I helped run the University of Glasgow Labour Club and were told by the party not to make a statement. And this is, happened to everyone has to stay completely silent. And what's interesting here is that I understand this idea of everyone, advice that you should sort of take a step back, relax, let's not feed this controversy, let's read the report, think about it. But if the party are asking people to, keep quiet, especially if they're on like official Labour Party accounts or whatever, then they shouldn't be going out saying incredibly controversial things. Because by saying, can everyone be quiet until a week's time or whatever, they're saying we will get to 100% set the narrative and we will not be challenged on our setting of that narrative. And by the way, the narrative which we are going to accept is that the establishment, British media, when they called the Labour Party institutionally anti-Semitic and Jeremy Corbyn a threat to everyone, they were correct. So Labour is basically saying, we're going to concede now that the Labour Party is the worst organisation ever, and you, all of you, committed Labour Party activists who've devoted so much of your time over the last 5 years to this institution, you have to let us say that, and you can't question it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I think there's maybe something convenient or instructive, like perversely, in the sort of quashing of dissent within the Labour Party, which is that, maybe, as I said before, we shouldn't be rehashing this issue. And I know that there are certain kind of contingents of the Jewish left that are very interested in doing that. And you know what, I respect them. But I've decided, not to engage and to focus my energy on that, because I think, what will really piss them off, kind of like Aaron was saying, is a restatement of our values and a kind of positive continuation of a left project, right? That is anti-racist, that is, anti-austerity, that is sort of internationalist, that is green, that is all this stuff. And, that's what's going to really fuck them off, is us just continuing to do what we do and refuse to back down on positive political principles, like we've seen with the Spy Cops bill, like we've seen with the Overseas bill, and like solidarity to all of those MPs that risked their jobs, in fact, as we discovered through a report which I did recently about disciplinary action which had been taken against those MPs, to MPs who are fighting the good fight, like Jeremy Corbyn did for many years from the backbenches, and I'm sure will continue to do. That, that is the effective route forward for the left, not necessarily winning the argument on anti-Semitism, as hurtful as it is to me, as hurtful as it is to so many people. Part of me wonders whether this is a chapter that we should close and redirect our energies towards just building, the world that we want to see.
I'm going to say I really feel that. My one concern is that if it is allowed to be the case that, and if to move on you have to accept that to state the truth is disallowed, that does seem like a bit of a slippery slope. And I almost see that Keir Starmer by sort of saying, I'm going to accept whatever I'm told the Labour Party is, I accept, which is his way of moving on the conversation.
Yeah.
He's essentially left a huge fucking trapdoor underneath him, because he has basically said, I cannot stand on my own 2 feet and make my own independent judgment when it comes to the Labour Party and racism. I am just going to accept what anyone tells me, whatever their motives.
Yeah.
And that's... what I mean, I suppose, is that whilst I don't think it's necessarily productive for the left to be rehashing the last 5 years instead of looking at productive ways to move forward, we do still have to make sure we aren't conceding in a way that it's going to make us weaker as we move forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there is probably a way to do that. But that is, in kind of like a precise, careful, specific, way, rather than a way that extrapolates out to say, there was no such thing. It was a witch hunt. It was a smear. So yeah, if you want to be forensic and take on the fucking forensic scientist that Keir Starmer is, fine, go for it. Meanwhile, I will be building a new left.
Great. Let's get some more super chats. Mama Anakia with 20 quid. Here is money I would have sent to the Labour Party had its leadership had any integrity. Thank you very much. As I say, I do think you might as well stay in the Labour Party, but if you are going to cancel your direct debit, send it our way, and you can build an independent left. Saint Maris Saint with 20 quid. I've left the Labour Party after 50 years. Here's £20 to buy some more nails to hammer into its coffin. Keep up the good work, Navarra. Ed Graham with 20 quid. We all knew Corbyn and the left were no longer welcome following RLB's sacking. I'm probably not going to quit the party because who knows what might change. But looks like Labour's going to be run by these clowns for a while. Yep. And yeah, that does seem likely. Sorry, I wish I had a sort of rebuttal to that, but no, it does seem like it's going to be run by these clowns for a while, but also you might as well stay in. Mr. Spooks with 20 quid. Could a more left-wing party pull Labour to the left, much like UKIP pulled the Tories to the right by targeting their left-wing supporters? For me, actually, that's really interesting you raised that, because I think it's important, actually. I think I realised this the other day when Corbyn first... I can't remember what was when he ended up having that crowdfunder. I can't remember what was the situation that sort of led to that particular moment. There was something going on.
Panorama?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it was the John Ware issue. It was the court where they'd sort of settled with the people who were on the Panorama documentary, and then there was people who put money towards this crowdfunder, which is happening again. And I was thinking the only issue that people that could split the Labour Party and cause electoral damage for Keir Starmer and maybe pull him to the left is Jeremy Corbyn. A lot of people are very committed to this man. So if he wanted to start a fringe party after being expelled, then yes, it wouldn't win power, but maybe like UKIP, it could pull them to the left. I think there are some problems with that argument. I'm going to throw that to Aaron Bastani.
Yeah, I think it's
a difficult one.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, I wouldn't personally want to start that party, but if somebody said, "Look, here's 10 million, start a left-wing party," my God, that would pull Labour in a certain direction very, very quickly. I think that's beyond dispute. And I think what Labour needs to be worried about is, even if you don't get an organised new party, it may be that you get 50, 60, 70 people. And I'm being quite serious about this. If he does get expelled, standing in Tory Labour marginals just so Labour lose, I think that may happen. I don't think that's a ridiculous thing to say. There may be a return to this kind of ad hoc, independent, left-wing candidates, but across the country. And if that costs Labour 10, 20 seats, because people forget. People are looking at national polling. There's not been a single election yet. There hasn't been a by-election yet, and people are saying he's the next prime minister. I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous. The Labour vote, and indeed the Tory vote in many parts of the country, is very, very soft. So across a lot of Wales, across a lot of the north of England, it's very, very, very soft. And something like that, or even just the Greens and Lib Dems bumping up slightly, really does hurt Labour quite badly. Now, I would never advise that. I think the Greens are a complete waste of time. I think the Green Party is just the Lib Dems without the MPs, and I think the Lib Dems are Tories without the donors. So I wouldn't advise that. I think it's absolutely optimal that people stay in the Labour Party. And one speck of bright light is that you had 30 Labour MPs, as you both talked about, 30 Labour MPs who went against the whip on spy cops. And there's never been that many Labour MPs basically defying the wishes of the British security apparatus, saying, actually, we don't think this is necessary. Now, you could say, well, they did that because actually it was such an overwhelmingly obvious instance of it not being necessary. You had dissent from all over the place. But I do think that's something to think about. It wasn't there in 2015, and it's a major step forward. Will that be kept? I don't know. I mean, ultimately, Keir Starmer wants all those people out of the party. He wants anybody who breaks a one-line whip out of the party, right? Because we've seen this. We broke this story last week. Rivkah broke it. You know, they're sending correspondence out to people, which is completely over the top. One MP said they didn't even see this in the Blair years. So I don't think they want any internal dissent within the party, but that shouldn't make people leave. Speaking personally, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, actually. As a journalist, I looked at the Jeremy Corbyn moment as quite unique. And I do think that it's important for obviously journalists to try to be as independent as possible. And I also worry that given that Keir Starmer doesn't particularly care for freedom of expression, I worry about self-censorship. I think that's an entirely important point, Michael. And I feel as a journalist, can I do what I want to do? Can I say I think the Labour's made the wrong call on this particular policy issue without, being disciplined by the Labour Party as a member? And I think as a journalist, that's a really, really difficult question. I think it will be increasingly so because I think actually Starmer has a deeply authoritarian streak in his politics. I think it's constitutive of his politics. We're seeing that now. But we'll see. I'm a bit like, Leonardo DiCaprio in The Wolf of Wall Street. I'm not fucking leaving. You have to get a chieftain tank to get me out of here. And that's how I feel about it. Because frankly, and this is why I feel that way, the left has to be serious about state power. You can't change everything or anything without state power. Ideas are important. Trade unionism is hugely important. Institutions are hugely important. Social reproduction and so on. Pressure groups are hugely important. But we have to be serious about state power. And even UKIP, who I think, no new left party would ever be more successful than UKIP in reshaping the Labour Party. Even UKIP ultimately don't know, or they didn't know, what they wanted to do with the British state. What's the political economy of Nigel Farage? How does he want, housing to be sort of distributed? What's his energy policy for the 21st century, or dealing with demographic aging and climate change? Now, they don't think those are problems generally, but even if they did, their job was never to.
Oh, Aaron's frozen again. That never usually happens. I don't know what's going on tonight with our particular connections. One thing I want to know from you, Rivkah, is obviously what Corbyn has been suspended. I don't want to, is saying that claims about anti-Semitism were exaggerated. And as you've said so many times, that's something that many Jewish people in the Labour Party have said. And actually, for obvious reasons, many Jewish people in the Labour Party have been the loudest people saying it, because they feel that, either they're in a position where it's most useful for them to say it, or they feel particularly passionate that they feel their identity group is being used to attack someone they are allied with. Yeah. And do you think it's possible that there could be lots of Jewish people now who get suspended for saying that anti-Semitism was exaggerated in the Labour Party?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've said many times in the past, and something that I restated today on Twitter, and actively invited the party to investigate me for that. And I think I would like to know if that is the precedent that they're going to set now, because this is something, as I say, that is a commonplace opinion that you hear on the Jewish left publicly and privately on the Jewish right. Like, I'm sorry, people I know who are quite conservative, sometimes capital C conservative, will concede to you. Even who was it? The former Speaker of the House, who was saying
John Bercow.
John Bercow, yeah, who himself said that this had gotten out of hand. He didn't think that Jeremy Corbyn was an anti-Semite, and so to see somebody who is a political opponent of Jeremy Corbyn, essentially defending him in an interview, suggests actually is very symptomatic of the kind of consensus among British Jews, which is kind of, we were concerned about this, but then it got way out of hand and in ways that made us kind of uncomfortable, and ways that were quite cynically exploitative of, quite frankly, Holocaust trauma. Except we don't talk about existential threats without having one thing in mind,
That's very important, very, very deep point, in fact. We're going to go to a couple of tweets. Peter Harrison tweets on the hashtag Tiskisauer: Chagos Islanders, Malayans, Vietnamese, Iraqis, Afghans, tell them that today is the most shameful day in Labour's history. At Keir Starmer, hashtag Tiskisauer. Very important point. Simon Bennett with a tenner says something I definitely agree with. 100% to Aaron for his "the Lib Dems are just Tories without the donuts." Going to reuse that. I thought that was a very good formulation, Aaron. The Greens are the Lib Dems without MPs, and the Lib Dems are the Tories without donors. Very good. All right, we've been speaking a while, haven't we? We should probably wrap up in a moment. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Before we do that, final points. Aaron, final points?
Yeah, did I manage to finish my final point about
Oh, yeah, because you
power?
froze last time, didn't you? Sorry, I forgot that. Yeah.
What's going on?
You come back now, you've unfrozen.
Yeah, so I'll finish by saying, if you're serious about state power, we live in a two-party system. You can't do that much without the state. I think it's really important to be part of that game. So yeah, look, you don't need to do much. You just need to go vote for the local candidate that you like, councillors, vote in leadership elections. It's not huge. And like I say, if you really can't bring yourself to do that, be a member of an affiliated union. You get to determine the next leader. And also, I hope you do far more than that. But that has a political dimension to it as well. Solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn, and also solidarity to all the Jewish comrades out there who I think, I thought today at least there'd be a little bit of a semblance of finality. But what we're seeing now, and that's in no way a problem that's been created by the HRC. They produced a really good document, really productive, positive document. But this isn't going anywhere, and it's deeply, deeply, deeply depressing. We have this kind of this dysphoria in politics where it seems that people in power are just trying to make things worse for everybody. It's horrible.
Sorry, I sort of sinking into myself there with that analysis.
But be hopeful.
Yeah, Rivkah, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, look, this was an accident waiting to happen, and I think a lot of Jewish people have seen this coming a mile off. Like, when are we finally going to be used as the, wooden stake in the heart of the vampire that is supposedly Jeremy Corbyn? And it was today. Someone I was speaking to today said that every time this comes up in the news cycle, every time that there's a big day for Labour anti-Semitism, Jewish people think, well, it can't get any worse than it already has, and we're continually proven wrong. So I think, I would reiterate what Aaron was saying, which is, solidarity to my Jewish comrades, and that it's been a really hard week, and Shabbat Shalom in advance. And let's all get together and hang out and lick our wounds, because it's been a really wounding 24 hours. Yeah.
And what I'd say is that today should have been a day when we were reading that report, that document, and sort of assessing the last 5 years in a rational, reasonable way, so we could have some finality and move on, work on things that needed to be worked on. And I do think, actually, that you shouldn't be scared of disagreeing with something in that report. I don't think the idea that someone says, I don't buy 100% of its recommendations, I don't think that should be beyond the pale. And it's very bizarre that has become a reality. You can't say, I don't quite agree with what's on page 60. If you say that now, you're suddenly like a denialist. I can't believe you said you don't agree with what's on page 60. So I think we could have been having a rational, critical discussion about this report, which took seriously the failings of the last 5 years, which were, in many respects, the result of unfortunate circumstances, sometimes failings on the part of Corbyn's leadership, often sort of vindictive representations and reporting on the part of the mainstream press and people who are opposed to Jeremy Corbyn. But one effect it had was to be really painful and traumatic for many Jewish people in this country and in the Labour Party, and we should have been reflecting on that today. Instead, what we're doing is having this row because Keir Starmer has taken a completely disproportionate, anti-democratic form of action against someone for saying what he believes, and which is, true, frankly. And by doing that, he has made that frank, open, productive conversation absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. How can that possibly happen now when someone saying that, he can't even say what sentence he has been suspended for. So how are people supposed to know what they can say? If you're in this democratic association, which is in the Labour Party, you're now terrified to even say, I disagree with maybe what's on page 60 or 60 or says 73. You might then be suspended from one of the two major parties in a two-party system. It's absolutely appalling. And the final thing I want to say is that, we all knew that once the Labour Party lost the 2019 general election, and especially once Corbynites lost the leadership of the Labour Party, that wouldn't be enough. That wouldn't be enough for the media. That wouldn't be enough for the Labour right. That wouldn't be enough for the Conservatives. It wouldn't be enough for anyone in the establishment to just say, look, you lost. You can go now and be sort of a junior partner in the Labour Party. You can still have, some sort of electoral, political, discursive influence, even if it seems like for now you're not going to take the reins of state power. No, they were like, we are going to crush you. We are going to crush you. And not only are we going to crush you, we're going to make you feel bad. We're going to make you regret that you ever got involved in politics so that you never, ever believe that you can change society again. And that's what they want. And that's what they're trying to do. And that's what we are witnessing day after day after day since Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party. And what they want is for you to accept that, for you to say, yes, it was a mistake for me ever to get involved in politics. I can't change anything. This could never work. But don't buy that, because you can change things. I actually think this was a big mistake by Keir Starmer. I don't think he quite understands the blowback that is going to come from this particular incredibly unjust decision, which they are struggling to justify. So the last thing you want to do at this point in time is say, again, I'm not begging you to stay in the Labour Party, but the last thing you should do is say, I'm withdrawing from politics. I'm not going to follow this anymore. I'm not going to bother anymore because change can't happen. The powerful are too powerful, right? Don't think that. And I'm also going to link that into my passion, which is Novara Media. So, one thing, obviously it's my job. I love my job, but also I am genuinely glad that after, Corbyn resigned, he did resign, but after Corbyn and Labour lost the 2019 general election, people were, Novara, I'm sure they'll sort of slink back into a hole now that the leader they backed has resigned. And since that happened, actually, our channel has grown and grown and grown. And we've got more viewers than we've ever had. We've got more subscribers than we've ever had. And what this shows is that there is a real desire in this country to have an independent, articulate left, which can show that actually, the left aren't mad. The Conservatives, they want to say, the Labour right, the media, they want to say, these people are scum, these people are deluded, never believe what they say. They hate the fact that there are articulate people out there sort of making these arguments, these common sense arguments, and also calling them out when they chat complete shit. But that is only possible. And I'm not just saying that's Novara, there's Tribune, there's loads of great organisations which have sprung up since Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, loads of great commentators. And that's what we've got out of this 5 years. And that's why we are still stronger than we were in 2015, even though sometimes it can feel like we've been thoroughly defeated. No, we haven't. So much survives from that movement. I think Aaron's going to come in.
I'm going to come in, and then I'm sure Rivkah can conclude. I think it's been a great show. I'm really grateful that you've both made this show tonight. We don't normally broadcast on a Thursday. I just want to say, to confirm what you said, Michael, do not give up on politics. This is not the future of left-wing politics in this country. When you look at Keir Starmer, it is not the future of left-wing politics in this country. He is, like I say, he has the electoral appeal of Neil Kinnock and the values of Tony Blair. He's an older man, but that's fine. Sometimes you want wisdom, but he's not the future of politics in this country. The future is, if you look at voter turnout last year, is very different to the present. And it does feel like this is a last hurrah for a certain genre of politics on the centre. I think it's centre-right politics, frankly, on the Labour right. But however, they would say they're centre-left. I think it's a last hurrah for them, quite frankly. And this is a really important thing to remember. In a way, we're going through a repeat of the 1980s. I think that the left, the Labour Party, but the left has lost this conjuncture which starts the global financial crisis. I think we've definitively lost it, just as the conjuncture of the early to mid 70s was definitively lost when Margaret Thatcher wins in 79 and then particularly in 1983. But what's different, and then after that, for the 10 years after that, the Labour establishment attacked the left in order to appeal to the electorate. They failed to do that. I think something similar is now happening. But what's different is that in 1983, younger voters chose Margaret Thatcher. They chose the Conservative Party. Now younger voters, and I'm not saying that older voters aren't important, of course they are, but we're talking about the trajectory of politics over the next 10, 20 years. Now younger people care deeply about green issues. I think that most would find it utterly absurd that Keir Starmer has an SUV and that he's knocking over a Deliveroo driver to see his tailor on a Sunday, and yet he claims to have green credentials. I think they find it absurd to look at the various has-beens and nobodies and bag carriers in Parliament. I think they find it absurd when Andrew Adonis, who's never been elected by anybody, is in the House of Lords and says that Jeremy Corbyn should leave the Commons despite being elected by the good people of his constituency. So hold on to that. Don't leave politics. We have to be hopeful, but be rationally hopeful, be rationally optimistic. That requires a fair assessment of where we are. We're in a bad place, but we're in a far better place than 5 years ago. And I think we have to think very clearly about the robust institutions we need to build going forward. Trade unions, groups, pressure groups, local organising, but also media, also political parties. And I think, for now, the Labour Party, if you're serious about state power.
Aaron, I'm really glad you came in because all of those points were incredibly important. What I was about to say, though, was to help build this independent left-wing institution, do two things for me, please. Hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and do please go to novaramedia.com/support, become a member and become a regular donor. What we ask for, we've always asked for, 1 hour's wage a month so we can keep growing, so we can keep building this independent left-wing institution that, will stop you getting... I know, listening, I'm normally quite a relaxed person, but to be honest, listening to LBC on the way here today, I was like, what the hell is going on? Because you've got an interviewer, you've got someone who's being, an interviewee who's being incredibly dishonest, and you've got an interviewer who is only egging them on to be more dishonest. They're sort of challenging them, but not on the things that they're saying that are untrue.
Yeah, I mean, there's a brilliant book written about the anti-Semitism crisis in media, Bad News for Labour, by a group of academics. And, so much of the Labour anti-Semitism crisis is a result of the very right-heavy media landscape that we have in this country. And that's why we created Vashti. The Jewish media landscape in particular has a toxic right-wing hegemony. That's why you get a joint front page between 3 newspapers that are supposedly competitors saying exactly the same thing about Jeremy Corbyn. There is no dissent in Jewish media, I am afraid. And that is a really toxic part of, and symptomatic of a national problem that we have, which is that the right-wing narrative about the Labour Party became dominant in our kind of consciousness, and that is reflected in the stat that Jeremy pulled up, which is that popular perception of the problem of Labour anti-Semitism was exponentially greater than the real problem, like over 35 times as great. It was like 34% of people thought that 34% of Labour members were anti-Semitic, less than 1%, in fact, had cases against them. This is a media issue that we're talking about, and I think part of it will be a media solution, diversifying the kinds of voices that you have and holding, the Labour Party to account in the right ways.
Such an important point, and a great point to end the show. Thank you so much for watching tonight. We've had 7,000 people watching live, which is great, really brilliant. Do come back. We go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. I've forgotten what day it is. It's Thursday, isn't it?
Yep.
It's been a very long day, which means we'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. That's going to be a great show. Don't miss that. But for now, thank you to my guests, Rivkah Brown and Aaron Bastani. And thank you for watching, for your super chats, your comments, your likes. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.